I never imagined my life would turn out like this. If someone had told me a year ago that I would go from being a housewife without a single dollar to my name to sitting at the head of a conference table, watching my ex husband squirm as he begged for my help, I would have laughed in their face. But life has a cruel sense of irony, and I learned that the hard way. I met Richard when I was 26, full of ambition and dreams. I had worked my way up in marketing, building a promising career. I loved my job, the sense of purpose it gave me, the satisfaction of seeing my ideas turn into successful campaigns. Then Richard entered my life, charming, confident, and successful in his own right. He owned a small but thriving consulting firm and seemed to have everything figured out. He made me feel like I was the most important person in the world, like I was his queen. And like a fool, I believed him. When he asked me to marry him, I didn't hesitate. I thought I was stepping into a life of love, stability, and partnership. But marriage with Richard wasn't what I had imagined. It started subtly. First, he suggested that I quit my job. "You don't need to work, sweetheart," he had said with that confident smirk. "My income is more than enough for both of us. You should focus on the home, on our future children." It sounded reasonable at the time. I wanted a family, and Richard convinced me that being a stay-at-home wife was a privilege, not a sacrifice. But soon, I realized I had handed him complete control over my life. At first, he gave me an allowance, just enough to cover groceries and household expenses. If I wanted anything extra, a new dress, a dinner out with friends, I had to ask him. And asking Richard for money was never a simple request. It became a negotiation, a justification of why I needed it. "Why do you need a new dress? You hardly go anywhere." "A spa day? That's a waste of money, Claire. I work hard for what we have." Each time, I felt a little more humiliated. Each time, I felt a little smaller. The realization that I was financially trapped hit me like a freight train the day I told him I wanted to go back to work. It had been 3 years since I left my job, and I missed it terribly. I wanted to feel useful again, to have something of my own. When I brought it up to Richard, expecting at least a discussion, he laughed. Not just a small chuckle, but a full condescending laugh. "You?" he scoffed. "You don't know how to make money anymore? Without me, you're nothing." That sentence burned itself into my soul. Without me, you're nothing. I wanted to argue, to scream, to tell him he was wrong. But deep down, I was terrified he was right. I had no savings, no job, and no way to leave. He had made sure of that. And then, just when I thought I couldn't sink any lower, Richard left me. One evening, he came home late, smelling of expensive cologne and cheap betrayal. He sat me down and told me, with the same smirk he used when he convinced me to quit my job, that he had met someone else. Someone younger. Someone more fun. He didn't even have the decency to pretend to be sorry. He simply walked out, leaving me alone in the home I had built around his life, with no money, no support, and no idea how to survive. The next few months were the darkest of my life. I had to face the humiliating reality that I had nothing of my own. Friends who once admired my perfect life suddenly disappeared. My landlord wasn't interested in my sob story when I couldn't pay rent. The job market was cruel to someone with a 3-year gap in her resume. Every rejection email felt like confirmation of Richard's words. I was nothing without him. But I refused to let him be right. I reached out to every contact I had left, begged for any opportunity. That's when I reconnected with Samuel, an old acquaintance from my marketing days. He had climbed the corporate ladder and now led a major marketing firm. When I told him my situation, he didn't pity me. He gave me a challenge. "I can offer you an internship," he said. "No promises, but if you prove yourself, there's room to grow." An internship at 32 years old. It felt like starting over from scratch, but I swallowed my pride and took it. I worked harder than I ever had, relearning everything I had lost, staying late, taking on projects no one else wanted. Within 6 months, I had climbed my way into a leadership position at a consulting company specializing in businesses in crisis. And that's when fate handed me the sweetest form of revenge. One day, as I reviewed the latest list of struggling businesses in need of crisis management, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, Richard's company. His once thriving consulting firm was now on the verge of collapse. I stared at the name on the report, my hands tightening around the paper. The irony was suffocating. The man who had laughed at me, who had left me with nothing, was now desperate for help. And fate had placed me in the exact position to decide his future. For a long moment, I simply sat there, absorbing the weight of it all. I had clawed my way back from the depths he had thrown me into. I had built myself up, stone by stone, out of the ruins he left behind. And now, he was the one drowning. I called my assistant. Schedule a meeting with Wallace Consulting, I said, keeping my voice calm. Have their CEO come in personally. The day of the meeting arrived faster than I expected. I prepared as I always did, reviewing financial statements, analyzing weaknesses, identifying possible strategies. But there was an undeniable thrill under my skin. I was ready, Dot. And then Richard walked into the conference room, Dot. For the first time in years, I saw him not as my husband, not as the man who controlled me, but as a broken businessman on the verge of losing everything. He looked the same in some ways, still tall, still carrying himself with that air of confidence, but there was a crack in the facade, a hesitation in his step, a tightness around his mouth. Dot. He didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? In his mind, I had been erased the moment he walked out of our marriage. But then our eyes met, and I watched the color drain from his face. I leaned back in my chair, allowing the silence to stretch between us. Then, with deliberate calm, I gestured to the seat across from me. Please have a seat, Mr. Wallace. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Claire, he finally muttered, his voice weaker than I remembered. I smiled. It's Miss Laurent now. The meeting proceeded, but Richard was rattled. He stammered through his presentation, his arrogance visibly shaken. He laid out his problems, clients pulling out, debts mounting, a tarnished reputation that made it impossible to secure new contracts. He needed our firm's expertise to rebuild, to strategize a comeback. Dot. He needed me. Dot. And that was the moment I had been waiting for. I kept my expression neutral as I listened, nodding in all the right places. But the decision had already been made. Dot. When he finished, I closed the folder in front of me. Unfortunately, we cannot move forward with this partnership, I said smoothly. Our firm does not collaborate with unreliable partners. Richard's eyes widened. Claire, I wish you the best of luck, Mr. Wallace. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Dot. He was still in his chair, frozen, as I walked out of the room. But as the door closed behind me, I allowed myself one final satisfied smile. Dot. For the first time in years, I was truly free. I walked down the hall, my heels clicking against the polished floor, my head held high. Every step felt like a silent victory march. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways, screaming at Richard, throwing his own words back in his face, demanding an apology he would never mean. But this quiet, calculated dismissal, it was better than any revenge I had dreamed of. Dot. Yet, comma, as I reached my office, a strange emptiness settled over me. I had won. Richard had been reduced to a desperate man clutching at the last threads of his failing business. And I had been the one to cut those threads. So why wasn't I feeling the rush of satisfaction I expected? I sank into my chair, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling window. The view was different from the one I used to have when I lived in Richard's world. Back then, I was locked inside a golden cage, staring out at a life I wasn't allowed to touch. Now the city was mine. I had built this new life with my own hands, piece by piece. A knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. My assistant, Julia, peeked in. Mister, Wallace is still in the conference room, she said carefully. He hasn't left. I arched an eyebrow. Is he causing a scene? She hesitated. No, he just looks lost. Lost. That was an image I had never associated with Richard before. He was always so sure of himself, so smug in his control. But I had stripped him of that, and now he was just a man without power, without direction, without me. I should have felt nothing for him. He had humiliated me, abandoned me, left me to rot. And yet, I shook the thought away. Richard was not my problem anymore. Dot. Still, comma, as the day went on, his presence lingered in the back of my mind. I went through my usual meetings, made strategic decisions, signed off on reports, but something in me remained unsettled. Dot. By evening, when most of my team had left for the day, I found myself glancing toward the hallway where I had last seen him. A part of me wanted to check if he was still there. I refused to entertain the idea. Instead, I gathered my things and made my way to the elevator. But as the doors slid open, I saw him. Dot. Richard was sitting on the lobby's leather bench, his elbows resting on his knees, his head hanging low. He looked up at the sound of the elevator, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked vulnerable. Claire? His voice lacked the arrogance it once held. I hesitated. I could have walked past him, pretended he didn't exist. But something made me pause. Why are you still here? I asked, keeping my tone indifferent to Dot. He let out a dry, bitter chuckle. Where else would I go? Not my problem. Not anymore, Dot, but as I looked at him, the man who had once stripped me of everything, now sitting in the ruins of his own making, I realized something. I had spent so much time fighting to prove I didn't need him that I had forgotten to ask myself the real question. Dot, did I want to be the person who destroyed him completely, or was walking away the ultimate victory? I took a breath, steeling myself. Good luck, Richard. And with that, I stepped into the elevator and let the doors close between us. Dot. As the elevator descended, I leaned against the cool metal wall, exhaling slowly. That was it. The final goodbye, the moment I had imagined for so long. Finally real. And yet, instead of overwhelming satisfaction, I felt something different, something quieter. Dot closure. Dot. When I stepped out onto the street, the city greeted me with its usual chaos. Horns blaring, people rushing past, neon lights flickering in the early evening haze. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. I had nothing left to prove. Dot. The next few weeks passed in a blur of success. My work at the firm kept me busy, and I thrived in ways I hadn't thought possible back when I was trapped in Richard's shadow. I led major accounts, spoke at conferences, and even received an industry award, something I would have never achieved if I had stayed the obedient housewife he wanted me to be. Dot. But Richard? He was falling. Dot. The news spread quickly in business circles. His company was officially collapsing. Clients were pulling out, investors were cutting their losses, and soon his name became synonymous with failure. I should have been ecstatic. This was what he deserved. Every article, every whisper about his downfall should have been a victory. Dot. But then, one evening, as I scrolled through my phone, I came across something unexpected. A grainy photo, Richard, sitting alone at an outdoor cafe, staring blankly at a cup of coffee. He looked thinner, his usual tailored suits replaced with something wrinkled and ill-fitted. He wasn't just losing his business, he was losing himself. I frowned, tossing my phone aside. Dot, why should I care? But that night, I couldn't sleep. Dot. It wasn't about pity, no. Richard had made his choices, and he was paying the price for them. But seeing him like that reminded me of something important. I had been there once, too. Dot alone. Forgotten. Struggling to rebuild from nothing, I had done it. I had risen from the ashes. But I hadn't done it alone. Samuel had given me a chance when no one else would. Someone had believed in me. Dot. And now I had a choice to make. I could leave Richard to his fate, watch him fade into obscurity like he had once wished for me. Or I could do something unexpected. Dot. Something he would never see coming. Dot. The next morning, I made my decision. I picked up my phone, dialed a number, and waited. Dot. When the line connected, I spoke two words that surprised even me. Hire him. The silence on the other end of the line was almost comical. Samuel, ever the composed businessman, finally let out a low whistle. You want me to hire Richard Wallace? The same man who left you with nothing and treated you like a trophy wife? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city skyline. Yes, but not in any position of power. He needs to start at the bottom. No shortcuts, no privileges. If he fails, he fails. But if he's willing to work for it, give him the chance. Samuel sighed. You do realize he might not take it, right? He's got an ego the size of Manhattan. I smirked. That's the best part. If he refuses, then I know he's truly lost. If he accepts, well, then we'll see how far he's willing to fall. The call ended, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing it for me. Richard had controlled my life for too long, even in his downfall. Now I was taking back the narrative. 2 days later, Samuel called me back. He accepted. I blinked. Seriously? Yep. No negotiation. No arrogance. Just a quiet, when do I start? I think losing everything broke something in him. I didn't know what to feel about that. Relief? Amusement? A flicker of old bitterness? Good, I said simply. Put him in entry-level consulting. No special treatment. Let him work his way up, if he can. Samuel chuckled. You're ruthless, Claire. I like it. But I wasn't sure if this was ruthlessness or something else entirely. The first time I saw Richard in the office, it was almost surreal. He wasn't the powerful businessman anymore. Gone was the custom-tailored suit, the cocky smirk, the air of invincibility. Instead, he wore a standard company ID badge, just another employee in a sea of workers. When our eyes met across the open office space, there was no anger, no resentment, just quiet understanding. He nodded once. I returned it. And then we both got back to work. Weeks passed. Richard kept his head down, doing the kind of work he used to mock. He sat in meetings as an observer, took notes, and learned from people he once considered beneath him. And for the first time, I saw something I had never witnessed in him before. Humility. One evening, as I was packing up, I found him sitting alone in the break room staring at a spreadsheet. He didn't notice me at first, so I spoke. "You're actually working late?" He looked up, startled, then let out a small laugh. "Yeah, turns out rebuilding your life takes effort." I leaned against the doorway. "So, what's next for you?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. For the first time in years, I don't have a plan. I'm just trying to be better than I was yesterday." That was the moment I realized something. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about something bigger. Growth, change, redemption. Not for him, but for myself. I had moved on. And Richard? Maybe, just maybe, he had finally started his own journey. I smiled faintly. "Good luck, Richard." And for the first time in our entire history, I actually meant it. Months passed. Richard kept his head down and worked. There was no arrogance, no shortcuts, no attempts to charm his way up the corporate ladder. If he was still the same man who once controlled me, he was hiding it well. And I moved forward. My career flourished. I took on bigger projects, expanded my network, and found myself in rooms I had never dreamed of entering. The shadow of my past no longer loomed over me. It was simply that, the past. But one evening, as I left the office, I found Richard sitting outside the building staring at the city lights. I could have walked past him. I could have ignored the quiet pull in my chest, the strange curiosity that had been growing over the past few months. Instead, I sat down beside him. He didn't look at me at first. "I was a terrible husband, wasn't I?" I exhaled. "Yes." A dry chuckle. "Didn't even try to sugarcoat it, huh?" I shook my head. "No point." Silence stretched between us, the city humming in the background. "I thought power meant control," Richard admitted after a moment. "That if I had the upper hand, if I dictated the terms, I'd never lose. But in the end, I lost everything anyway." I studied him. This was a Richard I had never known. Not the self-assured businessman, not the controlling husband, just a man who had been forced to confront his own failures. "People aren't possessions," I said softly. "You don't get to own them, no matter how much you provide. And love, it's not about control, it's about trust." He nodded slowly. "I see that now. Too late, but I see it." A part of me wanted to say it didn't matter anymore. That his realization, while appreciated, didn't erase the years of manipulation. But another part of me, the part that had spent months healing, growing, becoming someone stronger, knew that this wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. And I was ready to let go. I stood up. "Take care, Richard." He looked up at me, something unreadable in his eyes. Maybe regret, maybe gratitude. "You too, Claire." And that was it. No grand closure, no dramatic endings. Just two people who had once shared a life, now walking their own separate paths. As I walked away, the weight I had carried for so long finally lifted. I was free. Months turned into a year. Richard and I no longer spoke beyond the occasional polite nod in the office. He continued his quiet, steady work, never pushing for attention, never trying to reclaim the power he once wielded. And I soared. I landed a major promotion, one that placed me among the top executives of the firm. My name carried weight in the industry, and I relished every success that came my way. No longer was I the woman left stranded without income, without security. I had built myself into someone who would never be powerless again. Not. Then, one afternoon, Samuel stopped by my office. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You're not going to believe this," he said. I arched a brow. "Try me." He stepped inside, dropping a folder onto my desk. "Richard resigned." I blinked. "What?" He put in his notice this morning. No other job lined up, no big offers stealing him away. Just a simple, "Thank you for the opportunity," and a quiet exit. I stared at the folder, something stirring in my chest. Not regret, not loss, just curiosity. What did he say? I asked. Samuel shrugged. Not much, just that he needed a fresh start. I nodded slowly. A fresh start. For the first time, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The revenge I once sought, the desire to see Richard broken, had faded into something else entirely. I had won. Not by crushing him, not by watching him beg, but by proving that I never needed him to begin with. And now. Now he was starting over, just like I had that evening. As I left the office for the last time before my promotion took me to a new division, I glanced back at the empty desk where Richard had once worked. No bitterness. No pain, just quiet understanding. We had both lost something once, but in the end, we had also gained something greater. Freedom. And that was enough. A few months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself walking through Central Park, my coffee warming my hands against the chill. Life had settled into something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. True, unshakable peace. No lingering anger, no ghosts of the past clawing at me. Just a quiet satisfaction in who I had become. I had no idea that day would bring an unexpected encounter. As I approached a small cafe near the park's edge, I spotted a familiar figure at one of the outdoor tables. Richard. But he wasn't alone. A young woman sat across from him, laughing at something he had just said. Her dark curls bounced as she shook her head, amusement dancing in her eyes. She looked nothing like me. Her energy was light, easy, unburdened by the past. And Richard, he looked different. Not just in the way he dressed, more relaxed, less like the corporate shark I had once known, but in the way he held himself. There was no tension in his shoulders, no arrogance in his posture. He looked like a man who had let go. I could have walked away, pretended I hadn't seen him, but something inside me, perhaps the final step in my own healing, compelled me forward. As I approached, Richard's gaze lifted, and for a split second, surprise flickered across his face, then something softer. Claire, he said, standing up instinctively. The woman looked between us, curious but not threatened. I smiled, not out of obligation, but because for the first time it felt natural. Hi, Richard. He hesitated, then gestured toward the woman. This is Emma. Emma, this is Claire. Emma extended her hand, her expression warm. It's nice to meet you. I shook her hand, noting the ease with which she carried herself. She didn't look like someone Richard controlled. She looked like someone he admired. And that told me everything I needed to know. I turned back to Richard. I heard you left the company. What are you up to now? He exhaled, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Starting over. Consulting on a smaller scale, but mostly trying to do things the right way this time. I nodded, genuinely pleased. That's good to hear. There was a time when I would have wanted him to suffer, to struggle the way I had. But seeing him now, seeing the man he had become, I realized something. I didn't need revenge. I had already won. As I turned to leave, Richard called after me. Claire? I glanced back. Thank you. He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. I knew what he meant. I simply nodded and walked away, the last of my past slipping away with each step. I was free, and I had never been more ready for whatever came next. Months passed, and my life continued to thrive. The scars of my past no longer dictated my future. They were simply lessons etched into my soul, reminders of who I had been and who I had become. I had moved into a beautiful apartment overlooking the city, a place I had chosen for myself, paid for with my own success. I traveled, I networked, I built something greater than I had ever imagined for myself. My name carried weight in the industry, my work respected, my achievements undeniable. One evening, as I prepared for a gala hosted by one of our company's major partners, I took a moment to appreciate the woman in the mirror. Gone was the naive wife who had let herself be controlled. In her place stood someone confident, independent, and completely in charge of her own destiny. At the event, I was surrounded by powerful figures, CEOs, investors, industry leaders. Among them was Samuel, the man who had once given me my second chance. He raised a glass to me. Look at you now. I knew you had it in you. I smiled, clinking my glass against his. And to think, you hired me as an intern. He chuckled. Best decision I ever made. The night continued, filled with laughter, business discussions, and the thrill of knowing I had earned my place here. Then, as I made my way toward the exit, a familiar voice stopped me. Claire. I turned. Richard. He looked different yet again. No longer the subdued man working under me, but also no longer the arrogant businessman I had once married. He stood with quiet confidence, a man who had rebuilt himself in a way I hadn't expected. You look incredible, he said. There was no hidden meaning behind his words, no attempt to charm. Just an honest observation. Thank you, I replied. What brings you here? He gestured toward a group of professionals nearby. Consulting, it's been going well. I nodded, genuinely glad to hear it. I'm happy for you. He studied me for a moment before saying, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you didn't take me back when I begged. It forced me to become better. I tilted my head slightly, considering his words. Oh, we both became better. For a long time, I had believed my story with Richard was about revenge, about watching him suffer the way I had, but standing there face to face with the man he had become. I understood the truth. The greatest revenge had never been his downfall. It was my own success, my freedom. And in the end, I had given myself the best ending possible. I smiled, nodded once, and walked away. This time knowing I would never look back. The grand finale came not in a conference room, not in whispered apologies, but in the glaring light of brutal, undeniable justice. Richard's downfall wasn't just poetic, it was absolute. His company, once built on arrogance and control, collapsed under the weight of poor decisions, desperate gambles, and finally, legal scrutiny. The moment he manipulated financial records to attract investors, he signed his own destruction. The SEC investigation made headlines. Wallace Consulting CEO under investigation for fraud. His face was plastered on every business news site, the same smug expression now synonymous with disgrace. Clients fled. Employees abandoned ship. Investors sued. I didn't have to lift a finger. The world had a way of balancing itself. I stood in the courtroom watching as the judge listed the charges. Richard sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his once pristine suit now a desperate attempt at keeping up appearances. I could see it in his eyes, the moment he realized there was no way out. The same man who once told me I was nothing without him was now at the mercy of a system that saw him as exactly that. Nothing. When the guilty verdict was read, he barely reacted. There was no fight left in him, just a hollow acceptance. And then, just as the guards moved to escort him out, our eyes met. For a moment, I saw the ghost of the man I once loved, but it was fleeting, disappearing as quickly as my regret. I leaned in slightly, just enough so my words would reach him. You were right about one thing, Richard. My voice was calm, almost kind. Without you, I became something much greater. And then I walked away, this time, knowing I had won.